Welcome everybody to this webinar, an introduction to open science and ManyBabies webinar. We are very happy to have you join us today. And to get us started, some aims of this webinar, we would like to provide you with an introduction to open science. Many of you are already familiar with open science as indicated in the chat. That's phenomenal. So we will have a very nice discussion afterwards, I'm sure. So we would like to help you consider how to include open science practices in your research workflows, to point you to other resources that you might find useful if you want to learn more about the open science practices we are going to mention today. And we would also like to raise awareness about how important open science is currently becoming for psychological research, especially in the context of victim science collaborations like ManyBabies. So we're going to start by defining open science. So to do that, I would like to ask you to think about how we usually access research. This means, how do we usually get to know what scientists are doing? And if you think about that for a moment, you will notice that this is mainly through published articles, conference proceedings, recorded presentations, where researchers publicly share some results and provide an interpretation of these results. Right? This is usually the discussion and conclusions of articles or presentations. However, if for whatever reason we wanted to scrutinize the research process, we couldn't. And that is because certain parts of the research cycle are not openly available. For example, data wrangling, which refers to data cleaning, remediation, and munging. How was it performed? If there were instruments, for example, scales, how good and appropriate were they? Why did researchers utilize a particular approach to data analysis? Would results have changed if another path would have been taken? How does this data relate to other data sets that might be available? Well, these questions and others usually remain unanswered, which is problematic in itself. But very often, research is funded with government money. And when this is the case, the fact that we have limited access to the research cycle is not only problematic, but also non-acceptable. Think about research topics that have high impact, that are very socially important. For example, COVID-19, child abuse and neglect. So this is not really acceptable, the fact that we don't have access to the whole research cycle. So open science aims to provide solutions to this problem. Open science is a way of practicing science. We can define it that way, generally speaking. And I also like this definition by Jeff Rauder, who defines open science as endeavoring to preserve the rights of others to reach independent conclusions about your data and work. Indeed, the main idea driving open science is that we should strive to make all processes and products involved in scientific research available and accessible to all people without barriers or with minimal barriers. And this involves sharing instruments, the raw data, the code scripts that were used during the analysis, manuscript reviews, and any other material that might be relevant for citizens to understand what is going on with research. And as you surely suspect, the open science definition has a wide variety of implications. Open science is many things at the same time. It is a social movement, of course. Many people are joining this movement, and it's becoming slowly but surely a mainstream approach to research. Open science is an epistemological perspective because it relates to how knowledge is generated. It is an ethical framework with a set of associated practices, a scientific ecosystem made up of different open tools and processes, and it's also a political aim. For example, many countries have already started to mandate open science practices, and other countries are currently working on developing open science frameworks. And open science is grounded in important values such as transparency, reusing, participation, cooperation, responsibility, reproducibility, which is very important for robust research, inclusion, and sharing. And Melanie Emming and John Tennant coined this expression that I like a lot because it summarizes all the previous points. Um, According to them, open science is not an alternative way of practicing science, but just science done right. This is why open science is becoming more and more important. And we are going to talk about different open science practices today. And there are many, many components to open science. We are not going to delve into all of them today, but we thought it would be interesting to provide a list in case you want to search for more information. So we have preprint, open access, open data materials, open peer review, open grants, open notebooks and open labs, open source software, open hardware, open educational resources, and citizen science, to name just a few. There are more, even more components. So I'm going to start talking about preprints. So what are preprints? Well, preprints aim at solving an issue with the publishing process. Just imagine you conducted a systematic review of academic literature in 2022, and it gets published in 2024, which is totally possible because the publication process takes a very long time usually. Would this systematic review be updated? Would it be useful if the topic is socially relevant? For example, again, COVID-19. Well, probably not. Publishing times might render results outdated or of little social relevance. And when it comes to publishing, we also know that there are biases associated with prestige, nationality, methods, gender, among others. So the reasons why an article is not published can be really varied and not necessarily relate to scientific quality. So the conclusion is that the publication process acts as an unnecessary knowledge gatekeeper, and that knowledge dissemination and impact should not be limited by the publishing industry. So what is the solution to this? Well, that authors upload the manuscript they produce to public repositories where they can be freely downloaded. And this is what a preprint is. And it should be noted that preprints have not yet been accepted by a journal. These are the manuscripts submitted to a journal. And so they are not peer-reviewed either. So they become available almost immediately following the upload process. They just go through a technical check. But the good thing is that most repositories for preprinting support versioning. Versioning refers to the fact that authors can update the manuscript as it evolves, for example, thanks to a review process. Preprint authors enjoy some benefits. For example, the visibility of their research is increased well in advance of publication in journals. Preprinting also allows authors to claim authorship of ideas and methodological approaches because manuscripts that are uploaded are permanently timestamped. And this might become very important when applying for funding. Preprints make it easy for researchers to share what they are working on at a particular time before publication in journals. Preprints are also very useful for receiving feedback from the community because more people get access to the manuscript, more people can provide feedback. And preprints are also provide a smoother path to publication in some journals that work with preprint servers to analyze if certain preprints can be a good fit for journals, and they expedite the publication process. So here we have two examples of how beneficial preprints are. So this is preprint we recently published with Krista, which is entitled 10 Strategies to Foster Open Science in Psychology and Beyond. And this manuscript has been in review in a journal since June the 3rd. And until now, this preprint has had 493 views and 235 downloads, which is a considerable amount of views and downloads. So this has been great for us to get our message out there in advance of publication. And here is a more drastic example, maybe. This is the preprint of an article I published some time ago. And as you can see, the first version of the manuscript was uploaded in April 2018. And the manuscript was accepted in April 2020 and published in February 2021. So basically, thanks to uploading the preprint, I gained almost 4 years of research dissemination, which is quite remarkable. So as we will see in a moment, publishing in journals can have a negative impact on authors because they see the publications right when publishing in journals. So as this illustration by the subtitle wing conveys, preprints are also a great tool that allow authors to retain their rights and enjoy freedom to share the knowledge they produce. This is great. I am going to check the chat for a second because I see some comments. They are asking about the slides, and the slides, yes, indeed, will be available in a public repository. Okay, so how does this relate to open access publishing? Well, it is very much related. There is also a problem with paywalled access. How does the research cycle connect to the publishing industry? Well, usually government agencies fund researchers to carry out a project. Then researchers are required to publish results. So they usually submit articles to journals, and they are usually high impact journals because funders might require this. And publishers put the research behind a paywall to cover the cost of publication and also to make a huge profit. Just consider that prestigious outlets are edited by 5 publishing houses that control more than 50% of the worldwide article production, 70% in the case of the social sciences. This is an industry that has a global revenue of more than 19 billion pounds per year. And the profit margin goes up to 40%, which exceeds that of Google. So imagine this is a very profitable business. So when publishers put the content behind the paywall, content is discoverable because people can find the abstract and the title of the manuscripts, but it's not accessible without a site subscription. So what academic libraries do is they subscribe to these databases to have access to the content. The problem then is that publicly funded research is not freely available to society, but to a few, and only after paying exorbitant subscription costs. So this really is a problem. And if you want to delve more into the consequences of paywalls, I highly recommend this documentary called Paywalled: The Business of Scholarship that can be seen freely online. So the solution to this is open access. In the open access model, publications are fully and immediately available online at no cost for readers. So publications become discoverable and accessible. However, because publishing involves some costs, of course, somebody has to pay for them. Then, depending on who pays for the cost of publication, we have different types of open access. So these are the different open access flavors. So we have green open access, which refers to a process that is performed in addition to traditional publication in closed access journals. In green open access, the authors publish a manuscript in a journal, but the deposits, which is referred as self-archiving, the post-print version of the manuscript in a personal website, institutional repository, or open repository. That is, they put the post-print version in an open repository. And the post-print version is the manuscript version after changes made during the peer review process, but prior to the final formatting by the journal. So this is a great way of disseminating research, but there are some problems too, because some journals may not allow authors to self-archive the post-print version of their manuscript. And many journals also have an embargo period. So authors need to wait 6, 12, 24 months before self-archiving the post-print. So you can check this, for example, using the Sherpa Romeo tool, which is great for this, but this generates some issues. Then we have gold open access, where the publisher, which is oftentimes a commercial publisher, makes the manuscript immediately available for free under a CC license, which is a Creative Commons license. So this is great, but they charge an article processing charge to authors or their institutions. And these APCs, as they are known, are usually very, very expensive. So it's difficult for some researchers to cover these costs. And there's also the problem known as double dipping. Double dipping happens when journals that publish both closed and open access articles increase the percentage of open access articles without lowering the subscription cost. So they end up charging citizens 2 times for the same materials. So this is a strong argument against gold open access. And then we have what is known as diamond open access, which refers to non-commercial publishers, for example, universities or scientific associations, that also put manuscripts immediately available for free under a CC license. But the difference is that because they are funded by these institutions, they do not charge an APC to authors or institutions. So who pays for the publishing cost is the institution that supports the journal and not authors or their institutions. However, this might have a negative impact on academic assessment because most diamond open access journals don't have an impact factor, or they don't want to have an impact factor because they are against this metric. And also sometimes publication times are longer in these kind of journals because they don't have the same infrastructure as the one that enjoy journals by commercial publishers. And it's important to also consider how these different varieties of open access interact with mandates you might need to comply with. So, for example, in Canada, there is an open access policy that the tri-agency developed that says that grant recipients are required to ensure that any peer-reviewed journal publications arising from agency-supported research are freely accessible within 12 months of publication. Well, just imagine this, that you sent an article to Cognitive Psychology, which is published by Elsevier, and that has an embargo period of 24 months. So then you won't be able to comply with the tri-agency open access policy if you don't pay Cognitive Psychology so that they publish the article in open access through the gold route. You couldn't engage in green open access if you publish in this journal, because they also require authors to use a very particular Creative Commons license when sharing that is also not beneficial. So these kind of things are interesting to note and should be taken into consideration when choosing journals where to publish. And then I would like to talk a little bit about open and fair data, which is another open science practice that consists of making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So what is that data is findable? Well, it refers to the fact that data should be available online, deposited in open data repositories, for example, the Open Science Framework or Zenodo, that datasets have a unique and persistent identifier, for example, a DOI, a digital object identifier, and the data is up to date and has rich metadata associated that allows users to understand the context of each dataset. Then FAIR principles say that data should be accessible. This means that datasets should be openly accessible freely, that there is no sign-up process, and this is the preferred route. This means that people can download the dataset for free without logging into a platform, without creating a user. This might not always be uh, applicable because sometimes researchers deal with sensitive data, for example, so they require other users to authenticate and to have an authorization to use the data. Well, the FAIR principle says that when authentication and authorization are needed, there should be swift mechanisms for this. And then accessibility is also achieved thanks to support and documentation. For example, a dictionary of variables that allows users to understand what are these column names that I have into this data set that I don't really understand. For example, a column might be entitled HLEA. And what is that? What's that? Well, this might be, for example, the highest level of education achieved by subject. But if there is no description of the variable, we wouldn't know, especially if the values are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, which could be the case. Data should be also interoperable. This means that data within a discipline, there should be a common representation, a common language for knowledge representation. So for example, that across developmental psychology, all researchers code looking times, gender, age in the same way. But this is not always the case. There are huge disagreements regarding data coding. So we have yet to come up with a common way of representing knowledge in developmental psychology. There are efforts leading to that. And this is a very interesting area of research nowadays. FAIR principles also say that data should be combinable with other data, and which is related to the previous point. Data should be in an open format. This means readable but open source software, and also machine readable. And machines should be also able to read the metadata of datasets to allow for better comprehension of the context of the data. Again, metadata is very important. And finally, we have the reusable principle, which says that data should be published under a Creative Commons license, preferable the CC0 public domain license, which has no restrictions whatsoever to share and disseminate, and that there should be support and documentation for reusing the data. So there are many interesting materials to learn more about open data and FAIR principles. So I recommend this article and the Turing Weight, which is a nice guide for reproducible research, research data management, and there is a chapter specially devoted to the FAIR principles and practices. And now I will turn out things to Krista, who's going to talk about open materials.
Thank you so much, Nico. And I'm just going to take a moment to switch the screen share over to my computer. So if anyone has quick questions, we'll have more extended time for questions and discussions later, but this would be a good time.
Yeah.
Okay, can everyone see this screen share, Nico? Yes?
It's
We can
perfect.
see it?
Yes.
Okay, Fantastic. So Nico has walked you through an introduction to what open science is, and familiarized you to two sorts of things that you can make open in science. So manuscripts, which can be made open through preprints and through open access publications, and data that can be shared by using FAIR principles. So I'm going to talk first about open materials. So something else that you can make open in your research workflow. So let's contrast sort of the closed model to the open model when it comes to research materials. So research materials, and by that I mean things like questionnaires, experimental materials, stimuli. So in my research, we make recordings of sentences that we play to babies, we create images that we show them, all these kinds of things. So under the closed model, these are typically created by individual researchers and kept by them. So I would, keep those on my lab server. Maybe I would share them with people in my research group. People could email me, ask me for them. Maybe if I wanted to share them, I would, but they're not generally widely available under the closed model. And in some cases, research materials are actually sold for a profit. So standardized tests, intelligence tests, for example, can be very expensive to obtain. Under an open model, research materials can be accessed by everybody. And in fact can be reused. So this is a huge savings of time. And typically the research materials will be shared under certain different licenses decided by the author. So the great thing about sharing these materials is, first of all, less work. So reuse, more consistency. So say I want to replicate your study, I might be able to do so with the exact materials that you have used, rather than trying to somehow recreate them and based on some verbal description that you had in your methods section. And again, less duplication of effort. So just as an example of something that we've done in my lab. So this was a project led by Rachel Tsui, a former postdoc in the lab. And this was during the COVID pandemic. We couldn't test babies in the lab as we normally do, but we decided to do an online study with a tablet-based task. So Rachel spent a lot of time programming a whole tablet experiment where different images would pop up, babies would be taught words. It really took a long time to get this to work. What if you heard about this? What if you read this and you thought, oh, wow, that's so interesting what you did. I want to do my own variation on that, or I want to do my own tablet-based task. Well, Rachel has posted this online. So this is on the Open Science Framework website. Anyone can go there and download. You can see well, of course, the analysis that's related to open data, but you can see a demonstration of the experiment. You can actually download the different experimental scripts. You can download the audio or video stimuli that we use. You can create your own version or do any version that you want based on this work without duplicating this effort. As well, if you're reading our study and you're wondering, oh, what did the children actually see in the experiment? You can actually run it for yourself rather than, again, just relying on our verbal description. ManyBabies as well shares all of its materials. So ManyBabies 1 was a study that looked at babies' preference for infant-directed speech compared to adult-directed speech. So that high-pitched baby talk that many adults around the world do. And if ever you wanted to do a study in your own lab, you could use that exact same stimuli, those exact same recordings that we took from parents, which again were painstakingly made, painstakingly analyzed, painstakingly created. And I know that there are some labs that are using that in follow-up studies. So that's a small primer on open materials. Next, I'm going to talk about pre-registration. So what is pre-registration? Pre-registration is a record of what you plan to do in your research. So pre-registration, that's something that happens during the research planning stage when you're planning your study. It's a research plan that is time-stamped. It's immutable. So once you kind of upload it and stamp it, you can't change it after that. It's created before the study, and it's typically submitted to a public registry. So researchers have been doing research plans for many years before open science. It's called a thesis proposal, for example. It's called a research plan that you might keep in your lab. But the thing about this is that it's public, and someone in the future can look at it and compare sort of what you plan to do to what happened. So the plan might include your hypothesis, how you plan to collect your data, how many participants you plan to collect, what kind of inclusion and exclusion criteria you're going to have, different variables that you plan to measure or manipulate, as well as an analysis plan. So the sort of statistical model, different inference criteria, whatever you're planning. So there are different places that you can post a pre-registration. So this is just a table from this great paper from Harris explaining some of the different features that different repositories have. So you can use things like GitHub. The one that I tend to use most often is the Open Science Framework, because we also share, we also store our data and materials, so that keeps everything in one place, but there's no one place that you have to post a pre-registration. And there are different formats of pre-registration. So for example, on the Open Science Framework, there are different templates that will walk you through all the aspects of pre-registration. I would really recommend that for a beginner so that they don't forget anything. We often use the open-ended pre-registration, which is more of a narrative pre-registration, which can be better in other cases. For example, if you have more expertise in pre-registration, or the templates might not work as well for your particular research area. So here's an example. I'm not going to share the, you can certainly go look at it, but this is a pre-registration on the Open Science Framework. This is a study that's not published yet. We've actually now collected the data. We were looking at, again, a COVID project. We got families on Zoom. We mailed them different books that they read to their children. We wanted to see how different types of book formats might impact the way that parents read to their children. And so prior to that data collection, we uploaded, in this case, it was an open-ended pre-registration that explained how many children were planning to test, what the exact method was, our planned analyses and hypotheses, etc. So why would you want to do pre-registration at all? Maybe it seems like a lot of work. Well, there are really good reasons to think about doing a pre-registration. So you might have heard about psychology's replication crisis. Over the past 10 to 12 years, there's been a realization that some of the studies that we thought were very sure in the literature don't seem to replicate as much as you might hope. And at least some of this is due to questionable research practices. These are not necessarily malicious or people meaning to do bad things or meaning to be unethical in their research, but these are practices that often inadvertently add flexibility to the research and make our conclusions less robust. So one example, and I have to say that even in my own training in grad school, I was trained to do this. This was the kind of thing I was told was a good thing, and now we realize it is not a good thing. So one example is reporting kind of flexible post hoc analyses as if you had planned them. So maybe you plan to do a certain type of analysis, that p-value was a little too high. Oh, we're going to try this other kind of analysis. Or we're going to try these exclusions. We're going to try this covariate. And it turns out when you do that, it will actually increase your rate of false positives. So you'll have more type 1 errors. And this is also known as p-hacking. And so the problem is not doing these various analyses, but the problem is pretending that the one that worked is the one that you planned all along. A similar problem is harking, or hypothesis after results known. Again, I have been told in the past by supervisors, sometimes by collaborators, sometimes by reviewers to do this. So the idea here is you get your results and then you change your hypothesis based on kind of predicting that the results that you actually got. It can make a nice narrative structure, certainly, but it's not great for the scientific process to pretend that you thought something different when it's perfectly okay to have a hypothesis that is not confirmed. And we know that this is the way that science often proceeds the best. So what pre-registration does, or one thing that it really does to sort of prevent these things or make these things more transparent, is it really puts a firewall between two types of analyses that you could have. So you have confirmatory analyses and you have exploratory analyses. So your pre-registration has your confirmatory analyses. So these are the ones that you planned. They do things like confirm current knowledge, they're a direct test of the main hypotheses, and they aim to minimize this type 1 error false positives. But doing a pre-registration does not preclude you, does not prevent you from doing exploratory analyses. You can still do these, and you should still do these along with your pre-registered analyses. exploratory analyses are great for exploring new areas of knowledge, minimizing false negatives, creating new hypotheses. Maybe you notice something in your data that was completely unexpected and you decide to explore that. And that is absolutely great. What a pre-registration does is just allow you to say, well, these very interesting analyses were exploratory, unexpected. I'm going to evaluate them in that light versus these confirmatory analyses. So some of the benefits of pre-registration are, again, they kind of reduce some of these biases. So sometimes it can even be hard for me to remember, what analysis did we plan to do? What was our rationale for this hypothesis? Which way did we predict it? I can't remember. Honestly, it can happen to the most dedicated researchers. Now it's written down and you won't forget. Eliminate selective reporting, so you report everything that you plan to do. I find it's a real benefit for students that I work with, as well as myself, because it really pushes us to think everything through before we start the study. So we think, what is the theory? What is the hypothesis? What is the data collection plan? Let's do that power analysis to know what our sample size is going to be. What are the inclusion criteria that we want to have? What are the appropriate analyses? And sometimes in doing the pre-registration, we realize, hey, our thinking was not completely clear. Oh, oops, we should really include this measure that we didn't think of ahead of time. It can actually prevent a lot of problems in data collection. I also find it's great for collaborations because it really lets you work out the nature of the collaboration, the scope, the plan, rather than saying, oh, I thought you were going to collect all the data. Well, it's in the pre-registration that's saying, well, in which sites will the data be collected and how many participants? It definitely adds weight to your claim. So I trust people's claims much more if they were pre-registered than if they were not pre-registered, because I know that if they were pre-registered, the researchers were not engaging in harking or p-hacking. And the other thing that it does, and I think this is a wider benefit to the field that will change the culture, is that it shows the messiness of research. So it happens to me all the time, for example, that there are errors in my pre-registration. I forgot to put something in my pre-registration. That hypothesis I pre-registered completely didn't, come out in the wash. It was not confirmed. And that's very, very common in research. And I think when we read the literature and sort of journal articles that are in that more closed model, it's a very beautiful story that is told. But the real truth of how research happens is a lot messier than that. And this makes that more transparent. Some journals do use badges to recognize pre-registration. So that's fun if you submit to that type of journal. I will know that there are some drawbacks to pre-registration. These are things that we need to think about. So, oops, I went backwards. Okay, so what are the drawbacks? Well, it does add some time to the front end of your study. So rather than jumping right into data collection, you do slow down to really make that plan. I think it's beneficial in the end, but this could be a concern to some people. And I would say that the slowdown that you made at the beginning, you gain at the end because you've already made your main analytic decisions. You don't have to think like, oh, now how am I going to analyze my data? Students tell me, wow, it's so great. Once I have my data collected, I can analyze it so quickly. I already know what I'm doing. And sometimes as part of pre-registrations, people might in fact write an analysis script that they plan to then apply to their data later. Another drawback, and I kind of would put this in quotes because it's, in my opinion, not a true drawback, but it can be perceived this way, is that you can't p-hack as much and you can't hark as much. So for people whose research programs are really dependent on those flexible analyses trying to get that p-value, losing that flexibility might be a bit of a surprise to them that they may have more null results. I would say that these are more representative of the real truth and the state of literature, but it can, it can just be a change in some people's research practice and pipeline. So just to give you an example of what this actually looks like when you would write a manuscript. So this is from a paper that we published back in 2019. This was actually a pre-registration of a study with existing data, so an archival data set. So you can pre-register both studies where you plan to collect data, but also analyses. So here we mentioned that the data were drawn from a particular corpus. We were very open that we conducted some pilot coding of these children. So 2 of the children, we pilot coded them to make sure it made sense for pre-registration. And then it says, we then pre-registered our final methods by the Open Science Framework, this website, but prior to listening to or coding the remaining data. We mentioned that any deviations from the pre-registration are noted and justified. So that is to say, you most likely will deviate from your pre-registration. There will be things that are unexpected. Your data won't have the type of distribution maybe that you expected it to have. There will be missing data that you didn't expect. That's completely fine. All that you do is you note it. You note any deviations from pre-registration when you write up the manuscript. So to make it very transparent. And as an example of a deviation that we had in one manuscript, this was really driven by our data. And it again, to say that your pre-registration, doesn't limit what you do, but it just makes it clear what you plan to do. And it doesn't prevent you from, once you see the data, from sometimes making a different decision or reporting data two different ways, the way you pre-registered in a different way. So in this particular study, we had data from babies who were 10 months and 18 months, and we actually didn't really expect a big difference between what would happen at 10 and 18 months. So we just said, oh, we'll collect those two, collapse across those two ages, because that'll give us more statistical power. But as it says here, after preliminary analyses revealed striking changes in parental code switching across development, we opted to report analyses for each age group separately. So we looked at the data, we're like, yeah, collapsing it completely doesn't make sense. We justified this deviation, and we think that any reader or reviewer would say, oh yeah, you really made the right decision based on your data. You needed to change from your pre-registration. That's completely fine. All right, I'm going to move on from that and talk briefly about big team science. So big team science is sort of one of the things that brings us here today. So again, comparing the closed and open model. In the closed model of research, researchers tend to work sort of on their own with their students or a few collaborators. That's still something that I think should happen even in the era of big team science, but it used to be that this was one of the only ways that science really happened. Under this model, knowledge stays really siloed. So it's really hard for people in other labs to really get how things go in my lab or how we do things. We try to write it up in our journal articles, but there's a lot of details that are missing. And especially in research with hard to recruit populations like infant research, samples are small. So we know the typical sample size in infant research in the past has been between 16 and 24 babies per study. And for those who know statistics and statistical power, that's a worryingly small sample. At the same time, as someone trying to recruit babies from a recruitment perspective, that's a huge sample when I'm trying to get, babies who are exactly 18-month-old and French-English bilinguals hearing each language between 75 and 25% of the time. That's a huge sample from that perspective. So what can we do about these, some of these limitations of the more closed model? Well, under the open model of big team science, we have large groups of researchers who are collaboratively doing science. And in ManyBabies, we collaboratively design the projects together through many, many Zoom calls. We carry out the research all together. So many labs around the world are each conducting the same study that we've designed together. And we publish the research projects together. So all of the collaborators, in some cases, hundreds of collaborators, are all co-authors on the manuscripts arising from this research. We believe that this improves the research because we use consensus-based decision-making. So we have many experts and people with varying expertise and backgrounds participating in what is the research design, in what is the analysis that we should use, how should we interpret this data. And also it allows us to have much larger samples. So rather than a dozen babies or a few dozen babies, we can have hundreds or thousands of babies in a single study, which not only increases our statistical power, but it allows us to ask questions that we couldn't ask with a smaller sample because we're able to collect more data. We have more variation, for example, of babies learning different languages from different cultures, hearing different languages in different proportions, or having all sorts of diverse, rich experiences that we can track, and then we can see how that might predict their behavior. So this is our beautiful ManyBabies map of all the researchers participating in ManyBabies around the world. Currently, ManyBabies has 16 different studies going on. Some of these are published, some of these are in planning stages, some of these are in data collection, so in different stages. hundreds of collaborators. This is probably not even up to date because it's changing every day, across hundreds of institutions, 46 countries around the world. So it's a massive international effort. And it's really exciting because we can also exchange information. So in addition to webinars like this, which we hope to have more of, simply by participating in ManyBabies, you can be part of those consensus decision-making processes. Students can join a Zoom meeting where experts are arguing about how long a trial should be, or what stimuli are most appropriate, or what analysis to do, and can get involved in any aspect of the research project. So finally, I'm going to talk briefly about citizen science. Citizen science maybe being the only aspect of this that doesn't have the word open in the title, but there's something really open about citizen science. So under the closed model of science, who does science? Well, typically people with PhDs, they're trainees, maybe medical doctors. It's restricted to people with a lot of training in science, which of course has its benefits. These people have the training, but at the same time, science is for citizens, and citizens have a lot of knowledge and expertise and things to contribute to the scientific process. But under the closed model, there's not a lot of opportunities for citizens to participate. Under the open model, we have the public participating a lot more in research, which increases the reach and relevance. And there's new movements. I won't talk about this much, but for example, community-defined evidence. So really talking to communities about what evidence means to them and what they already know. So an example of this is the website Children Helping Science. So this was started during the pandemic. And essentially, this is a place where parents who want to participate in research online can go and find studies that might match their children's age and other demographic factors and participate in a research study. We've also heard from colleagues in other areas. So you have, for example, bird watchers who are adding to repositories of different birds, which birds are in which areas of the globe. And so there are more and more ways that citizens are participating in science. So that's all I'm going to say on those topics for now. I think we're moving to our questions and discussion section of this talk. Yes, I'll stop my screen share for now.